America today is more and more resembling Britain in the 18th century, with the moving of production out of America, and with the things that AI is doing to various labor sectors. This is an economy that does not involve a lot of Americans and does not benefit a lot of Americans. And the decisions are being made, if decisions seem bewildering to a lot of Americans, but why are we doing this? Why are we doing this with taxes? Why are we doing this with our military? Why are we doing this overseas? It doesn't seem to benefit us in any way. It's because the interests of the state are diverging from the interests of the people, and we're getting towards a sort of 18th century situation.
All of us, or almost all of us, live in what are called nation states. We take it for granted. We think it's always been that way. But in fact, it hasn't. Humans have been around for approximately 300,000 years. Nation states, well, just a few centuries. In fact, for most of the world, they weren't all that common until the 20th century. So where did they come from? What are they? And are we moving to a world beyond nation states? What would that mean? And does that portend a crisis for those of us who live in some of the world's oldest ones? All of those questions are highly relevant in our present political moment, and Rana Dasgupta has just published an awesome book, I think, covering all of it. I know it's just the start of the year, but honestly, this is going to be one of my books of the year. I just know it. Absolutely brilliant reading. Riveting, dare I say. Not always the case for non-fiction, especially when it's over 400 pages. Rana Dasgupta, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you so much.
I say this, I'm always very pleasant to the people that we interview, and I say how wonderful their books are. This is really good.
Okay, thank you. That's very kind.
After Nations, The Making and Unmaking of a World Order. It's very unusual for me to read a book in February and think, famous last words, I feel like this is going to go on lots of people's best books of 2026.
Well, that's nice to hear.
I'm sure your agent has speculated about those things as well. But it's very, very good. And of course, After Nations, very clear, it's about the nation state and its integrity to the world order in recent decades and centuries. Let's start from the basic building block of your analysis. What is a nation state?
So a nation state is what we nearly all live in, slightly under 100%. A few million people, much less than 1% of the world lives outside a nation state. In something like Palestine would be one of those territories, Western Sahara would be another of those territories, and Greenland. So many of those territories are very, very much in the news, precisely because if you're not in a nation state, you don't have the kind of sovereignty that has been almost universalized. You're much more vulnerable today to all kinds of things than people who live in nation states. But the nation state itself, I would describe as a modern form of government, developed over long centuries in Europe, but finalized in its sort of architecture, let's say in the 18th and 19th century. Finalized by certain kind of philosophical ideas of how citizens should be collected into a political community. Liberalism was very important in that, the idea of the state as a sort of ultimate arbiter and the ultimate authority, treating all its citizens equally, subjecting them all to a set of laws equally, etc. But it was also, and this is very important to my analysis, very much a financial and technological achievement as well. It was the nation state was invented by imperial powers. France and Britain are the center of my book. And so those powers had a very particular idea of how profit should be generated and how profit should be recycled in the nation state to build institutions and all those sorts of things. And it would not have been possible without certain technological advances, especially in the areas of military and information, because the classical definition that political scientists will give you of the nation state is that it involves the monopoly over violence. So you have to be able to deprive all other power sources of their ability to fight you as a state. And it's also dependent on certain kinds of propaganda. That's to say that you have to build your population into a community that has a shared sense of its nationhood. You have to tell that population certain stories about the history, the affect, the purpose of collecting together into a nation, and giving them the sense that they have relationships with each other that are very different from their relationships with everybody else. So that they might, for instance, pay taxes in order to support each other. They will be willing to invest in each other's welfare and all that sort of thing. So this is, as I say, something that does not really exist. I mean, many of these elements are ancient, but in this particular configuration, we're talking about a modern situation. There were only about 50 of these entities in 1900, but they were universalized very much under the superpowerdom of the Soviet Union and the United States after the Second World War. So today we have 193 seats in the UN. And as I say, nearly everybody in the world lives in one of these things.
So the universalization of the nation state, very recent. And this is very much, undergraduate political science. I appreciate some people watching, listening, they think, well, I know all this. But equally, many people just take that for granted. They think that nation states are enduring and they're much more venerable than they actually are. Like you said, it's a very recent phenomenon for much of the world. So they universalized very recently, maybe even, let's say, in the lifetime of your and my grandparents, great-grandparents.
Yep.
Very recent, living memory. Well, where do they come from? I mean, nations, of course, go back thousands of years. Where do nation states come from? What's their genesis?
So in the book, I tell a long history of France and a long history of Britain. And we see the sort of slow evolution of the things that we would today associate with the nation state. So in France, I tell a theological story because the nation state is also a faith object. It is a community of people that think that they have almost mystical ties with each other. And I date that back. I start that story in the 13th century. Britain, I tell a financial story, which, again, I go back to medieval times. There are lots of elements of the nation state that we can date back for centuries and centuries. But the particular kinds of financial, technological, and, as I say, propaganda unities that emerged in the 18th century, these are very much a European creation. And as I say, these European countries were using the incredible power and dynamism of the arrangements they had made domestically to conquer much of the world. So many people in the world, their first experience of their first encounter with the nation state was not a very positive one. They received the sort of onslaught of foreign nation states and were subjected to them. And a huge amount of I think there are lots of things that I would like to draw out of this book, but one of the first critical point I would make is that a lot of the things that we see as the most heroic achievements of the nation state, the most moral achievements, let's say democracy, for instance, human rights, a lot of these things were first considered and applied in nations that were using their control of much of the rest of the world to fund those achievements. So democracy is quite expensive. If you want to deliver those kinds of rights to people, if you're confident that they have sufficient stake in the nation state, that they're going to broadly vote along acceptable lines, i.e. they're not going to vote to bring down the state, or they're not going to take up arms against the state. If you're confident enough you can give those kinds of political rights to everybody, you have to have given them a pretty positive situation, especially economically, but increasingly in lots of other ways too. And the way that Britain did that and France did that was essentially to extract from the rest of the world. So a lot of the institutions that we associate with the leading states in the 19th century were funded in that way. So there's a paradox from the very beginning that giving rights, giving democracy depended on depriving other parts of the world of those things. So these are the things that are not intuitive if you're growing up in a place like Britain. You're not told that the history of your rights depended on other people not having those rights. And these are some of the ways in which, even today, the nation-state system, people in different parts of the world have a very different relationship to it. There are lots of people whose induction into that system was traumatic and who still have a much more problematic relationship to it than people in the old heartlands of the nation-state system.
I mean, some people watching or listening to this, because I hope, of course, we have a very wide audience to this conversation, will be saying, oh, this is just, more woke nonsense. We have somebody, a very erudite, learned person saying that actually the benefits of our political system in recent centuries is premised on, the exploitation of other people. But it's a more complex argument than that. I mean, some of the zingers in this book are fabulous. This idea that liberal democratic systems in Europe, Western Europe in particular, are necessarily premised upon some kind of economic subordination of China over the long term. These two things rise and fall at the same time. Question, therefore, being, well, with the reemergence of China as a technological economic power,
right.
What does that mean for the liberal democratic policies of the West? Maybe this was just a blip. So for people who are skeptical about the arguments being made here, these are very sort of big picture, very thoughtful points. I want to go back quickly to France because it's something I'd never really engaged with before. This idea of mystical ties at the heart of the nation state. Obviously, I'm British. I've been raised here. When you study political philosophy here, you learn your Locke, you learn your Hobbes, you learn about this idea of the social contract and economic obligations sort of underpinning political ones, etc. And then I'm just reading this book at the start, and you're talking about the crown of thorns being purchased by Louis IX in 1238. And this was a way of sacralizing certain relations and furnishing the king with political authority in a new kind of way. So I guess people aren't that familiar with this. Tell me a little bit about 13th century France and this relationship between political authority and divine authority.
Yeah, I mean, this was stuff that I started thinking about a few years ago, and in many ways was one of the most exciting journeys that the book took me on, because like you, I hadn't really thought about this before. But when I started thinking about this book and thinking about what is this object that I'm thinking about, what is this condition that we're all in, and how would I historicize it? I thought I would not start with money or law and things like that. I would think about and at the time that I started thinking about this book, nationalism was itself a big subject. Western nation states were becoming recognizably more nationalist, and nationalist feelings were very much in the news. So where do those feelings come from? And why do we have nationalist feelings that are different in kind from our attachments to our cities or our workplaces or any of the other kinds of communities that we belong to? And so I went on this sort of investigation of the role of religion in creating the state. And so, as you say, I start with Louis IX, who I'd seen one line, or I'd heard one line in a podcast in which I heard this story that Louis IX in 1238 bought, and the quote was, the most expensive object in the world, and spent half of the annual income of the kingdom on this object. So what could possibly create that level of financial value to a few thorns that were what remained of the supposed crown of thorns that Christ had worn at the time of crucifixion? And when you see the use that Louis IX made of this object, and that subsequent kings also made, and that even today the French state makes to some extent, because when Notre Dame was burning, and that's where the crown of thorns is today, getting these relics out was an affair of state. It was incredibly important. These relics still, to some extent, guarantee the French state. this was the crown of God. It was the crown that literally sat on Christ's head at the moment that he sort of redeems the world. It is the most extraordinary relic in the Christian faith. And Louis IX bought it at a time when the Byzantine Empire that had been for a long time the custodian of a lot of these relics was collapsing. So this is the time when, in the time following the Crusades, when a lot of these relics move into Europe, and where Europe takes over the mantle. Paris is the New Jerusalem. Christianity becomes a European thing rather than a Middle Eastern religion. So Louis IX has this crown. The crown of God has descended onto the head of the King of France, and he uses it to create an idea of kingly authority that's very different from being a duke, for instance. And he is at that time a smaller landowner than many of the dukes in France. So it's not obvious that as a king, he's more powerful than them. But over time, what happens is that we get this idea of the state as an object that deserves truly awe-inspiring, that has truly awe-inspiring powers, and that deserves allegiance and loyalty of a quasi-religious nature. And I think we can see this today in, say, remembrance ceremonies, ceremonies of war memorial, for instance, when we are explicitly told that we are part of a community that involves everybody who has ever died in this state and everybody who is yet to be born in this state. It's not like other communities. It is an eternal community. And that's when quasi-religious feelings sort of are elicited from all of us about being British or French or whatever it might be, as opposed to something else.
We love our events here at Novara Media. It offers a great opportunity to meet our supporters, our viewers, our listeners, our readers, the people that frankly matter most to me in this organization. We hold those events relatively regularly. We've already had one this year. Another one is on the way on the 19th of March on a Thursday at 7:30 at Earth Theatre in Hackney. You can buy tickets for that in the link below. It's called Death in Westminster. It's kicking off a podcast series with Dalia Gabriel and Kojo Karam. They're looking at dark money and how Britain and other countries too benefit from the shadow economies which fuel the wealthy, the powerful, and sometimes the famous as well. Join us for that event. Like I said, it's on a Thursday. I think the true start of the weekend these days. Buy a ticket. You won't regret it. I'd heard of, divine right of kings and so on. But you don't think about how that manifests itself as a historical trajectory. So you just presume, these people accumulate a ton of military power. They were able to suppress certain people,
right,
to dominate a certain geographical entity. And at that point, they then start to configure the ideology as an afterthought, very sort of bad Marxism, right? They have the physical expression of the power, and then they sort of build up the ideological expression. But that story you tell of the Crown of Thorns is fascinating precisely because, like you say, the nation state obviously isn't even a thing, let alone a dominant sort of unit of international analysis. And, you have the Norman kings, you have various other political entities in modern day France, which are, vying for legitimacy and power with the King of France. And so, it just really, it contributes to a much more sophisticated, interesting understanding of how history works. I've spoken about this with David Harvey in the past. He's very skeptical of this idea that, the means of production are transformed and then you sort of get the capitalist ideology and you get all these other things. And he says, well, if you look back to Elizabethan England, you actually have wage labour there and you have factories in Madeira in the 15th century making sugarcane. And it's actually a much more complicated story. And so I think this is of a piece with that. I want to fast forward a long way to a gentleman called Qutb.
Right.
And this really gets to the heart of 20th and 21st century critiques of the liberal state from radical Islam. And I'm using this as a jumping off point because it seems quite an elegant way of getting there. What we see with the Crown of Thorns in the early 13th century is this attempted sacralization of the state and furnishing a quasi-religious authority onto the state. Qutb and the sort of the political Islamism that follows in his wake, they view this idea of the state as almost polytheistic.
Yes.
And I hadn't actually understood the nature of their critique until I read this book.
Right.
Because you're looking at all of this stuff in the long durée. They look at it as polytheistic, and that's why they don't owe the state a sense of political obligation, because actually it's idolatrous to do that.
It's exactly that.
I mean, that's extraordinary.
Yeah, I think these are very critical aspects of the world we're living in that to some extent, especially in the West, we've disowned religion. We've wished to exclude it from our conversation about politics, and therefore we're not very sensitive to some of the religious energies that are at work. So on our way to Qutb, I would just mention a kind of what I describe in the book as a sort of 18th century reformation of Christianity, in which a lot of the power that was attributed to the Christian Godhead was redeployed for the state. So in order to get over the religious wars in Europe, philosophers reinvented the state as a kind of quasi-god, the mortal god, as Hobbes calls him. And the allegiance that you were previously as a Catholic or a Protestant supposed to give to your respective conceptions of the Godhead, forget all that, forget all your differences. Everybody now is subject to the state, which has its own sort of divine presence and borrows a lot of the attributes from the Christian Godhead. The state is all good, the state is all powerful, the state is all knowing. So this is a religious conception of the state, and Hobbes and a lot of these people are in their origins theologians, and we're still in this religious conception of the state. And if the sort of disintegration of liberalism produces lots of religious eruptions, it's because liberalism itself was always a religious formation. And that's why when we get to people like Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian radical activist and theologian from working from the 1940s until his execution, I think in 1965, is very conscious of the fact that the values he is being asked to accept in an Egypt that is whose elite is basically borrowing these liberal values in order to administer the kind of high-level capitalist activity of Egypt, which is especially cotton, but there are, of course, lots of French and British businesses. They run the Suez Canal. This is producing a liberal elite which has pretty much, European values when it comes to things like social life, even things like alcohol, etc., interactions of men and women. So Sayyid Qutb sort of writes an enormous amount of Quranic commentary, essentially to discredit liberalism, the secularism that was associated with Nasser, with whom he was massively embattled, and this liberal conception of the mortal God. Because exactly as you say, he said, no, this is blasphemous. To give our religious allegiance to the state, to deliver to the state what is the due of Allah, is idolatrous. The state is not a Godhead. There is only one sovereign. It is God. And we have to dismantle all these man-made institutions that we're being asked to treat as godlike objects. So here we have, I think, the most significant alternative conception of political and social organization in the world today. It is the most, I think, in the long term, more than communism. It was Islamist critiques of liberalism and of the nation state that are enduring kind of problems for this nation state system.
Yeah, and at the start of one of the chapters, you have a quote, again, I'd not read it before, from Ayatollah Khomeini, talking about how in 1980, so this is after he stopped pretending to be, a nice pluralist,
right.
quasi-progressive, and he's saying, look, we did a revolution not for sort of nationalist sentiments or for people to have a a sense of obligation to the nation state, but we did it for Muslims. And it's really interesting because there's another quote from Khomeini where somebody asks him, what is the essential achievement of the Islamic Revolution of 1979? And he says, Iran will finally be governed from Tehran, i.e. not from Moscow, not from London.
Right.
So
Right.
it's interesting, these tensions between politics and faith, sovereignty and a wider sense of sort of religious duty and community. This critique, which is in our lifetimes an Islamic critique, as you say, it goes back much further, and you have the same or similar critiques from religious figures in Europe.
Correct. Correct.
And one of them is, again, a very fascinating figure. My French is terrible. Maurras. Who is Maurras and who is Corel, is it?
It might be Maurras, actually.
Maurras, there you go. Well,
yeah. Charles Maurras. So, these are people, the feeling that the state is making claims that are too large for itself, that the state is an iconoclastic object that does not respect lineage, religion, tradition, folk cultures, customs, that it's trying to even out all the differences within a nation state and make everybody an identical citizen atom. It's not just people in the colonies. It's not just Muslims. There are lots and lots of people in the world that feel this about the state. And all over the world today, there are criticisms of the state that come from these places. But it began in Europe itself. Europe itself faced a lot of this, and nowhere more than France, because, of course, France has the ultimate sort of iconoclastic moment in its history, when you literally cut off the head of the king, and when therefore, and you begin from year zero, as they call it. The calendar begins again. We have no history, and everybody is a citizen. All previous titles disappear, and everybody is a French man or a French woman. There are lots of people who don't like that and feel that everything essential is lost in that process. And Charles Maurras is today regarded as one of the intellectual ancestors of Le Pen. I mean, and people like Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of Marine, would be very much part of his lineage. So he's essentially saying, to get France back, we need to have, once again, a Catholic state, a Catholic theocratic state, and we need to put back into place a lot of the sort of feudal and spiritual, mystical realities that were lost in the French Revolution. So Maurras is explicitly a monarchist and thinks that only monarchy can really bring French people back to their roots and to their culture. That's I think today at a very, very unusual position. There are very few monarchists left in France, but a lot of his other ideas about the state religion, about the inadmissibility. In his day, Jews were the real problem. This is what really, really angered him, and Protestant ideas, as he called them. But of course, those ideas have been very successful also in the contemporary period as Islamophobic ideas.
You've got a quote from the start of one of the chapters from Maurras. Everything is illogical and ridiculous in modern individualism. We uphold the necessity of a state religion and in a form as distinctly theocratic as that of the all-sovereign papacy of the medieval West. And then, I'm sure it's not an accident, you have a quote directly beneath from Sayyid Qutb in 1964, so best part of 70 years later. No sovereignty but God's, no law but God's law, and no power of a person over another person, because all power belongs to God. Broadly saying similar things, which is fascinating because, of course, people like Maurras and his intellectual descendants, and I think you're right to say, of course, Le Pen, the modern French identitarian far right, I'd say the same in England as well, in Britain.
Yeah.
I think it's a bit more complex because, elements of reform are basically just Thatcherites and English liberals, economic and social liberals, but it's a bit of that as well. I think the European far right actually and this is the story we never talk about over the last 30 years, their critique of capitalism dovetails massively with that of radical Islam.
Absolutely.
And that's not to say that, they're the same thing or they like each other or they agree with each other. But that post-liberal critique, which has really come into view in the last 10 years, they're drawing on really similar sources. And there's this quote from Maurras again, and sorry to do this, but I mean, it's just extraordinary. This is something that Nigel Farage, maybe he said it at school. He might not say it now, but maybe he thinks it. Certainly people think this in Reform about the UK. So this is a quote from Maurras in the 1890s. France is losing its nationality. She's governed by Jews, Americans, Austrians, Germans, Swiss, and Belgians. She is the victim of cosmopolitan finance, cosmopolitan literature, and cosmopolitan thinking. Our state anti-Semitism consists of taking back from the Jews what they have appropriated, as in that's a programmatic anti-Semitism, and most particularly their French nationality, since they have a nationality already which is indelible and which they still retain. And 130 years later, there are political operators across Europe saying precisely the same thing, often about Muslims.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I mean, I think that you're right to draw small distinctions, because I think Britain has... The reason I tell this religious story in France is that I think that religion from medieval times through the massive trauma of the religious wars, which I think, again, are much, much greater in scale than anything I had realized before I went deeply into that history. And through to the Enlightenment, where these philosophers are really trying to reconfigure these religious forces. How can we possibly have a state not explode or collapse while these religious forces are so naked? We have to redeploy them for state purposes. That process is going on at a time when Britain has already kind of figured out its, let's call it state religion, and that is essentially capitalism. Britain is not, I think, at any point, well, maybe at an earlier point, but Britain is not in modern times such a religious state, I think, as France. And it hasn't, most of these battles are not religious in such a theological way as they are in France. Britain sort of didn't have that moment of sort of state recreation in the 18th century, which both America and France do. And both America and France are much, much more religious than the UK. The UK is, I mean, you use the word Thatcherite. The UK does ultimately come back to very pragmatic things about how does money work and all that. Race is much more significant, I think, in the British universe than religion itself.
Michel Houellebecq, the French novelist.
Yeah.
He's worshipped by the European right, obviously. And I have to say, some of his stuff is, very interesting to read and thought-provoking. For people saying, oh my God, Aaron Bastani loves Michel Houellebecq. Yes, he says many bigoted things. Although he strangely once said he'd vote for Macron. Anyway, but he is a peculiarly French writer. The way that he takes on fascism and nationalism and identity and religion, it's impossible to think of a British writer that would be like Houellebecq. So I think that distinction is right. And the sort of schism, I mean, maybe it's earlier, well, it is earlier with Henry VIII and whatnot, but the jumping off point in this book for the uniqueness of the British polity is the Glorious Revolution, which nobody talks about anymore in this country. If you talk to somebody like Peter Hitchens, who's in his late 60s, early 70s, they'll say that going to school, that was,
right.
You read Macaulay's History of England and you learned about the Glorious Revolution. It's literally not taught anymore in secondary schools, certainly not mandatorily anyway. So what's so important about this Glorious Revolution? What is it, and why does it make England, Britain, this unique story over the subsequent 150 years?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical, because it is in some ways, you could say, the inception of the world that we have been living in until quite recently, and that is a world administered in very great part by two superpowers, two capitalist English-speaking superpowers, Britain and America. And I see the moment we're in right now as the sort of the end of that American hegemony and the beginning of something very different, quite unfamiliar over the last 2 centuries. And what happened in 1688, when essentially the British commercial elite lost their patience. There'd been several kings coming and going over the previous, 40 years, lost their patience with essentially a kind of feudal conception of kingship, and looked across the sea to the Dutch Republic, where the state was already in the hands of a bourgeois capitalist elite. And they were driving state policy in the Dutch Republic for very much capitalist reasons, to benefit the businesses and the enterprises and the overseas ventures of this elite. Very liberal with respect to things like religion, because these were not relevant to capitalist transactions. They were interested in in the rule of property law, and they had extremely advanced financial institutions, the most significant stock exchange in Europe, and very, very advanced debt markets. And these were the things that the British commercial aristocracy wanted in Britain. So they wrote a letter to William and Mary. He was the stadtholder. I think this is I forget how we translate that title
It's Nassau, I think, is in there, a stadtholder of Nassau, and goodness knows.
Yeah,
So William of Orange, we say.
William of Orange. There was a letter written by the collected commercial elites saying, please come, you will have a good welcome in England, the bloodless revolution, as it's called. And essentially, William comes in and does exactly what they hope he will do, which is to restore the financial health of the currency, to impose bourgeois laws by which the king himself is also bound. That's to say, the state cannot raid private property in the way that previous kings have been doing, and turned the sort of power of the state outwards onto colonial projects, because already by the late 17th century, the commercial elite was starting to see projects in the Americas, projects in Asia, very much as the future of the expansion of the capitalist system. So William presides over that, and Britain then becomes the center, the laboratory for well, actually, it's been going on for a while, because property law is very important to early conquests in the Americas. But Britain becomes very much the laboratory for this whole conception of property that then drives the British Empire until its end, and which, to some extent, is the global legacy of Britain today, which is to say that, I would describe the nation-state system as the political apparatus for the capitalist system, and its primary role is to impose at all levels of organization property laws that are kind of recognizable to everyone else, to enable capital to flow essentially without borders around the world. So what happened in Britain in 1688 and thereafter is absolutely of universal significance.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are having it. We don't just, however, do video interviews, which are also podcasts, of course, here on Downstream. We do events as well, and newsletters, including all the anecdotes, vignettes, and recommended reading. We don't slip into the main video. If you want to get that newsletter landing direct into your inbox every Sunday, go to novara.media/downstream newsletter and subscribe. Ash and I love writing it, and I think you'll really enjoy reading it. Yeah, returning to that idea of, history operating through a constellation of forces, you've obviously got the intellectual contributions of people like John Locke,
yes,
who completely transform our understanding of property, Thomas Hobbes completely transforming our understanding of sovereignty and obligation. Fast forward to people like Adam Smith about, actually how, the almost providential intelligence of markets.
Yeah.
So you've got all of that. You've also got the steam engine, but you also have this centralized nation state which is consolidated, and they actually seek to have a political sovereign who is amenable to the interests of a bourgeois elite, which already exists in the Netherlands, but obviously England and Britain is much larger. And it's that confluence of these things,
Yep.
as well as the coal deposits being near major cities, which means that Britain has this kind of takeoff in the mid, let's say, 18th century. You write a line, actually, about how authoritarian and oligarchical this country was. You know, we don't think about it very often. You use that word liberal, for instance, about, you know,
Right.
they wanted, you know, a relatively liberal order in terms of guaranteeing property rights, etc. But there are parts of the book I read, again, I wasn't familiar with some of the data points that I talked about. It sounds like a tyranny.
Yeah.
You know, 250,000 men potentially were press ganged into the Royal Navy and the British Army. 250,000 men, and only 200 people were shareholders apparently in the Royal Africa Company, which is, you know, this one of the leading players in terms of the slave trade as it kicks off, relating to this country. Only 200 people. And we talk about, you know, the 1%, but that's an amazing ratio, right? 200 shareholders. 250,000 men, almost all men, I presume, being press ganged into military service. This is very much at odds with the enlightened crypto-democratic story we're told about the Glorious Revolution, isn't it?
Well, you know, again, we're getting to a key part of the argument of this book, because, first of all, yes, the way that the Glorious Revolution is often narrated is this the beginning of democracy, the beginning of human rights. No, it wasn't. It was the beginning of liberalism in its capitalist sense. That is to say, free markets, property rights, all that sort of thing. A lot of the other things we associate with the liberal project, such as universal suffrage, came a century and a half or 2 centuries later. In actually, universal suffrage came 240 years later, if my maths is correct. So why the delay? And I think it's in this delay that I see a lot of lessons about what the nation state is. And they're lessons that are extremely relevant to us today, because Britain was not a failed state by any means in the 18th century. It was rapidly becoming, and would become by the early 19th century, the global superpower, the leading capitalist power, and with the defeat of Asian rivals, the supreme economic power in the world. It was a very successful state, but it did not need most of its population to participate in the political system. Most of its population was not relevant to the primary economic accumulation by which this state survived, which was all overseas. This was economic accumulation primarily through Asia, through Asian products, things that were produced in India and China and traded around the world, and increasingly also in the Americas, cotton and tobacco and those kinds of businesses. This is where the economic growth was. The British economy was growing between 1% or 2%, but a lot of these enterprises were growing at 25, 30, 40% a year. So, so you didn't need the British population for this accumulation, but also you weren't going to share it with them. They weren't participating in it in any way. So essentially, the political prerequisite for this system was the political exclusion of nearly everybody. So land-owning men, property-owning men were the only people who had a political voice and could stand for political office. The reason this is relevant is that I think that America today is more and more resembling Britain in the 18th century. Increasingly with the moving of production out of America, industrial production out of America, and with the things that AI is doing to various labor sectors, you're moving towards, and I don't think either this is a purely economic process, it's also a political assault on labor, on all the rights that labor has claimed from the American state over the last century or so. We're moving towards an America which also, doesn't need its population in the strategic way that it needed its population in the 1950s and 60s, where the working class was key to American power. It doesn't need its population, but increasingly, its population is shut out of the main drivers of the economy, and therefore there is pressure on the American state to withdraw a lot of the political rights that the population has enjoyed until quite recently. increasingly, and I think one of the short-term strategy is basically conceal the reality from Americans so they don't really know what's going on. But increasingly, it is becoming clear, or it will become clear, that this is an economy that does not involve a lot of Americans and does not benefit a lot of Americans. And the decisions are being made, if decisions seem bewildering to a lot of Americans about why are we doing this? Why are we doing this to taxes? Why are we doing this with our military? Why are we doing this overseas? It doesn't seem to benefit us in any way. It's because the state, the interests of the state are diverging from the interests of the people. And we're getting towards a sort of 18th century situation. Again, Britain in the 18th century was a very successful state, and America too can also be a very successful state, which holds the keys to the expansion of the capitalist system and is driving it through Silicon Valley and all these things. But many of the sort of political dividends that we thought came from success as a state, as an economy, do not seem to be coming anymore. They seem to be on the decline. And I think what we learn from this, and this is one of the things that I think is really critical that I would like to draw out of this book, is that there is no single line of history pointing towards one outcome. States and their economies go in cycles, and sometimes the interests of economies and states seem to be very much in tune with the interests of populations. And states actually are eager to give away political rights to their populations because it's in everybody's interests. You have to gather up your population into some sort of political consensus because you need them. But at other times, it might not be like that. And I think that we need to start looking at the period from about the 1930s and 40s in the West, or let's say in the United States for this point, until around 2000, as a time that's very, very exceptional, and that the future may not look like that at all.
Yeah, I think that is one of the observations which is most politically germane for the present moment in the book. And just to return to what you said at the start of that point, because this is really key, Britain in the 18th century effectively, you say, has two economies. One which is domestic, one which is overseas, and the one which is overseas has these huge rates of return, and that's, if you're an ambitious young man, that's where you want to be.
Right.
Very similar today, of course. If you're an ambitious young person in the United States, to a lesser extent than here in Britain, you want to be in Silicon Valley, or you want to be in finance, you want to be in venture capital or asset management, or working for Google or Nvidia or something like that. You don't want to be making consumer durables, the American market, in Detroit or whatever. And the observation there is, like you say, the principle of labor as being the source of value for Britain, for America, necessarily aligns with the sort of democratic settlement that these countries, working classes, benefited from. That didn't exist in Britain in the 18th century. The contention you just made is that we're moving back to that in both countries. I suppose.
And I mean, I would say, a shorthand for that point, a quick way of saying it is that there is a very, very close correlation between industrialization on a massive scale in the West and democracy. And deindustrialization, artificial intelligence, and all that sort of thing has a very different relationship to maybe has very different political corollaries. And that's the world that we're entering into now.
I suppose a critical reading of that is that obviously, and I know you wouldn't say that they're the same, but we're in a world now of 99.8% literacy, incredibly low cost of entry to communication. In the United States, you've got more firearms than you have people. And it does certainly feel that in a highly literate world, in a world where collective action is actually far easier than it was in the 18th century for ordinary people.
Absolutely.
It does kind of feel that, yes, the economic model is possible, but the authority which underpins it is very, very difficult. And, lots of people on the right talk about, the turn to civil war or whatever. And I think that's a stupid, irresponsible thing for any politician to ever do, because as a politician, your job is to stop civil war. But I can also see the impulse to say it, because clearly the imposition of that economic model in a world with mass literacy and mass firearms, ability to collectively organise, a sense of national belonging and obligation to one another, at least among certain people, I can see how that's not politically viable in the way that it was in the 18th century in England, even though, of course, like you say, that was superintended with massive amounts of violence. And the point you say about actually at certain points, because certain people will be listening and watching this, and they'll be saying, well, I'm a good Marxist. I know that the state is, it merely acts in the interests of the bourgeoisie, the great Lenin quote. But history says that's not always the case, as you've kind of just said there. If you look at Britain in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, there is clearly a greater amount of political consent given over to working people. In the 1830s, it's given to the middle class with the Great Reform Act. And that goes hand in hand with British hegemony and its super status as an economic sort of powerhouse. Your point, though, is that is very, very time limited, and it's unique. And it probably, it's probably already in the distant past. Another point you make, which I've already sort of hinted at in this conversation, is the relationship of all of this with Asia.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
This is just brilliant, right? So, of course, the industrialization of Britain, other parts of the West too, is necessarily premised on the deindustrialization in the case of India, China as well. If now those two economies are going to go back to the historical norm of being by far the world's two largest economies, certainly China, what are the consequences? Because of course that wasn't the case for 18th century Britain.
Yeah. I mean, just in response to what you just said, I mean, I think that yes, it's true that taking democracy away, let's say from Americans, would be a very, very difficult process. And citizens are extremely articulate. They can easily self-organize in all sorts of ways. And there would be limits to what the state could do. I would just say in response two things. One is that we should not underestimate what the monopoly of violence means. You did refer to sort of citizen firearms in the United States and all that. But I think when we saw, protests in Hong Kong and the determination of the Chinese state to put down those protests, we should not underestimate what state power can do. When you control the courts, you control the jails, the police, the military, you have a lot of options. And that is, well, I would simply say that our optimism that democracy always wins and the people always win is based on a rather sort of thin slice of history. But it's also true that states themselves also have powers that they didn't have before. The people do, but also states do. And this is one of the kinds of collaborations between Washington and Silicon Valley that we're seeing today. I mean, Elon Musk is doing quite a lot to at least inject noise into the situation, such that all the clarity that people might have, their ability to self-organize and to create mass movements and everything, that is being massively interrupted and refracted by the very companies that are reconfiguring the American economy. So I think that's very important. So on Asia, I think we talked about liberalism, democracy, all those things as being highly correlated with the moments when the West was very, very industrial, had industrial economies. But we also should remember the relationship that the West had to the rest of the world in this time. So I talk in the book about a book by Branko Milanovic called Global Inequality, when he essentially says that at the turn of the 19th century, in 1800, being in one region of the world or another, it didn't really make any difference. What mattered was class, because being rich in Africa or Asia or Europe was pretty much the same thing. But from 1820 to 1974, you see almost a straight line of the sort of pulling away of the West from everywhere else, becoming wealthier and wealthier compared to everywhere else, such that by the end of that period, it was better to be poor in the West than rich elsewhere. And it's not a coincidence that that time frame, that 150 years from 1820 to 1974, is also the golden period of Western liberalism, when country after country overturns all kinds of tyrannies, all kinds of feudal systems, and the West becomes homogeneously democratic, et cetera, et cetera. Spain and Portugal may be exceptions, but broadly the West is a liberal bloc committed to very, very generous ideas of the citizenry internally. But the peak of that process, the moment to which a lot of people look back today, the mid 70s, that's the peak of equality, democratic institutions, and all those things in the West, is also the moment when the West is at its greatest advantage vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And what happens in 1974? Well, it is the moment when Asia starts to climb back into the global economy, such that places originally like Hong Kong and Taiwan and South Korea start to climb the ladder of economic rankings. And later on, of course, and Japan is already highly developed by then, but it's especially China that starts to turn things around. So China has, at the beginning of this period, 1820 to 1974, been destroyed, totally destroyed, from its peak as the largest economic power in the world to the time of the Opium Wars. Through that century of humiliation, as the Chinese remember it, China becomes essentially irrelevant to the global economy. And from 1949, Mao, to the early 70s, continues to be totally isolated. And so this Western liberal triumph happens when there is no need to contend with Asia. Even India is also completely sidelined as an economic power in the 50s and 60s, the Hindu rate of growth, as people call it. So the moment of Western liberalism, all the astonishing achievements that we associate with the Western state from the 19th and 20th centuries, they have in common this sort of weird Asian absence. The beginning of that time and the end of that time are bookended by the Asia's decline and then rise again. So already today, we can easily identify the rise of China as one of the factors that's clearly driving the sort of spiritual crisis in the West, because suddenly the bottom 50% of many Western countries have found themselves in direct labor competition with Asia, and finding that therefore the value of their labor is dropping because Asia's a newcomer to many of these things and has much better systems, as well as fewer political rights in many of those places, fewer benefits, etc. So inefficient Western labor is trying to compete with very efficient Asian labor. Its value is dropping, and those people are feeling we're not really part of this national project anymore. We're not benefiting. The profits of this system are not accruing to us, and we're seeing other people capturing those profits and drawing away from us and having lifestyles that we can never imagine. We're also seeing Asian and Indian tourists with sort of fancy clothes and beautiful hotels coming and showing us that life in other places is very good. So already the sort of early signs of the sort of unraveling of Western liberalism have a lot to do with the rise of Asia. But I think that has much further to go because of other things we can discuss, which have to do with the role of America in the world, very fundamentally.
I mean, I live in Portsmouth. I live in Southsea, which, home of the Royal Navy for a very long time, used to build ships, doesn't build them anymore. Well, maybe that's coming back a little bit. But, now it's Korea and China, the other sort of leading shipbuilding places, I think maybe Japan as well. Maybe India as well. But Britain certainly doesn't build them like it used to. And large parts of Portsmouth weren't actually rebuilt after the Second World War, or just were rebuilt terribly. And I'm always struck by Chinese students just walking through Portsmouth and walking past something which has basically been a demolished building site for 25 years, or a vacant Debenhams building with plants growing out the top, And I feel like, what a what's going through their head? They've been raised on an ideology that is, the West, certainly the older ones, mid-20s, maybe they're too young now, but the world I was growing up in, the West is wealthier, it's more advanced. I presume they must look at large parts of the UK as a developing country compared to where they come from. Now, I know rural China is a separate thing, but if you're coming from an affluent part of China, from an upwardly mobile, upper middle class family or a wealthy family, I can't help but feel that they would feel that way. And it's just a really striking recognition. And I do think very slowly amongst the British political class, the media class, it's kind of hitting home. But even until maybe 2020, I don't think they really thought about it, which is kind of terrifying. On China, again, just so many riches in this book, historically. You talk about the Song Dynasty and how extraordinary it was. There's a great quote here about, its relationship to England. In the 11th century, 200,000 families were probably employed in iron production. This is the 1000s, right? William the Conqueror time, which increased 12-fold between 850 and 1050 Common Era AD to 150,000 tons, which is comparable to the amount produced in England in the early 18th century, right? But this is China in the 11th century.
Right.
Just incredible. And you talk about the industrial capability that China had under the Song. How close was China in the 11th century to actually an industrial revolution, to breaking through to a new mode of production, which never actually happens until the late 18th century in this country?
Yeah, I couldn't comment on that. I mean, but a lot of people have speculated about these. Of course, Song China came to a violent end because of the invasion by Mongol armies and the establishment of a new Mongol dynasty. So we don't know what could have happened. And that new dynasty had a completely different idea of Chinese organization and destroyed many of the systems that were supporting that kind of technological advance. So we don't know what could have happened. It was very extraordinary. And I think the only thing I would say is one of the interesting counterfactual questions I found when considering all this stuff is, why did some countries not have an industrial revolution? What was the necessity in Europe for having it? We talk about these things as if they're kind of laws of nature, that, if you devote enough time to scientific and technological thoughts, one day you're going to hit upon steam power. But I think one of the things that's very apparent to me, and one of the big motivations for a lot of the people who are funding these developments, is Asia. Asia was so much of the silver was draining out of England into China, because China was the sort of silver sink of the world. Silver was more valuable in China than everywhere else. So there was this sort of drainage of metal into China, and what Europeans were getting from Asia was industrial products, especially things like textiles from India, but also a lot of Chinese ceramics, tea, silk. A lot of things like this were coming from Asia. India and China were absorbing a lot of the currency of Europe because of their industrial superiority and their very, very important commercial products, especially textiles. So one of the things that drove I think not only European technological innovation, but also slavery, was the constant attempt to undercut Asia, the constant attempt not to be economically subordinate to Asia. So there's a very furious kind of investment in that idea of industrial revolution. So I think some of the questions about why Song China didn't develop steam power is simply they didn't need to in the same way. They didn't have that overwhelming need to save themselves expensive labor, etc.
It's a fascinating reframe, isn't it? The idea that the whole of Western development is just to deal with the trade deficit.
Right, exactly.
Which is a world we're now returning to.
Yes.
So we've talked about Asia, India, China, this extraordinary idea that the impetus for industrialization for the West, the development of slave economies in the Western Hemisphere, was basically a trade deficit, the economic magnificence fundamentally of China. I want to go back to America, more recent history. Of course, your book is about the nation state. And you make this claim, which is that the nation state is the sort of fundamental apparatus of American empire, particularly after the Second World War. So you write, where European empires had reduced and usurped national governments, the American empire multiplied and backed them. Rather, as the Roman Empire's administrative unit was the province, the American empires was the independent nation state. As the editor of Fortune put it in 1942, American imperialism can afford to complete the work the British started. American imperialism does not need extraterritoriality. Most people, again, will associate the era of the nation state with one of sovereignty, democratic self-government,
Right.
but you're saying the complete opposite. Well, for the most part.
I think this is another thing that I'm very keen to communicate about this book, because I think what often we miss, because we read our national press and we're deeply ingrained, most of us, in our own national politics. So we think of our nation state as a discrete unit that's separate from the other nation states and has its own sovereignty, can make its own laws, its own policies and all that. And what is missing from this is the system. When we say the nation state system, it's not a loose term. The nation state system is itself a single object, especially now. I think in the wake of the 1980s, the Washington Consensus, etc., which actually accumulated new coercive powers over individual states, and in some ways completed the American empire, which was an unfinished project in the 1940s and 50s. We have a system. And when I say that inequality between states and regions continued in a straight line until 1974, it is to say that the American empire is exactly doing the work of the British Empire, the same work. What is that work? It is to transfer resources and wealth from poor parts of the world to rich parts of the world. That was the purpose of the British Empire, and it's also the purpose of the American empire. But the American mechanism for doing that is different. America does not seek to, for the most part, America's not, after 1945, trying to occupy vast swathes of the world. It thinks it can impose capitalist laws and policies on the world through external coercion. America, of course, has had a long training in that because it has existed in a hemisphere where there have been sovereign states for a long time. Since the 1820s, most of Latin America is already sovereign states. So America has grown up not occupying, areas of the world where there are no nation states. It's grown up planting gunboats, sending in sort of threats, ambassadors, infiltrating systems, applying tariffs and other kinds of pressures, basically to get its policies and its desires legislated in foreign sovereign states. And so this is the vision of the United States from 1945. Let's have a world of sovereign trading states operating according to rules that we will set up in the United Nations, but also very importantly through the World Bank and all those arm's length financial institutions. We will monitor them. If necessary, we'll send in armies to back the right kind of leadership. And you have that incredible, we call it a Cold War. It was not that at all. It was an incredible moment, 3 decades of violence, when the US fought over that sort of influence in what we call the Third World. So we have an empire whose unit is the sovereign state, and which becomes, as I say, complete after the 1980s, when America hits various kinds of political crises and limits to the system that had existed up to that point. A lot of states were too sovereign. They were really independent. They were doing things that didn't align in any way. There were sort of resources that were not being made available to the capitalist system. And there's this, of course, in 1989, the Soviet issue sort of also disappears. And you have a world in which, through some of the mechanisms I describe in the book, things like SEZs and bilateral investment treaties, and of course through the WTO, which is set up in 1995, you have a reconfiguration of the imperial infrastructure such that to a very great extent, sovereign governments are doing the work of this empire, policing the piracy of American goods, making sure that American corporations have access to mining resources and all those sorts of things, and massively increasing the efficiency of the flow of resources into the industrial system. And of course, this is the situation. This is the system, which is also operating on the dollar and all that, from which America is drawing its rents. And largely playing the role that Britain played in the 19th century at the height of its power, supplying the global economy, supplying the global legal system, keeping the oceans open with the most powerful navy in the world, but also crucially, and this is what is changing in the precise moment we're in today, absorbing many of the costs of that system. So Britain at the height of its power and America at the height of its power were willing to back a lot of the military costs that the system needed to run, and to absorb other kinds of costs, like charging low tariffs on countries that themselves charged high tariffs on their exports, because their commitment to free trade was such that they were willing to pay for it, even if other countries didn't fall in line. That was what it looked like to be a capitalist superpower. You had lots and lots of privileges and profits, but you also had costs. And today, America is that situation is changing, and America is reconfiguring its relationship to the global system considerably.
I mean, you even have Trump, rather than extraterritoriality as the principal, Trump is just overtly saying, let's have Greenland, let's have Canada.
No, but that's the thing. I think these are the clear signs that America is now an equivalent power to China or Russia. It is no longer in some other layer of the global system. It is in the same layer, doing the same kinds of things, and realizing that because China has outflanked this system that was a very formal system of law and markets, by which America took hold of a lot of the basic resources of the world. China, which does not have the same commitment by any means to the nation state as the fundamental unit of global administration, China has done deals with lots of people who are not nation states, warlords, and all kinds of factions within states, and has sent in companies into places that American corporations can't function, and is extracting much more efficiently than American those parts of the world. So America is having to catch up with China and do things that it hasn't done for decades, such as simply contemplate conquering places or seizing their oil on the high seas. These are very 18th century things.
How did China do that? Because China jumped through all the hoops that you've talked about in terms of how American empire is administered. It's a civilization state, but it's a nation state. It was, it joined the WTO in 2000.
Yeah.
It adopted market economics. It welcomed American firms. Yeah. It buys lots of US treasuries. So how did China manage to outflank the United States and actually elevate itself to a sort of new level of not being a client, but actually increasingly a rival?
Well, I think it is very explicit within the Chinese Communist Party that the restoration of sort of Qing dynasty power levels of power that last seen in the Qing dynasty is very much the stated ambition of the Chinese Communist Party. The idea of China existing at the center of a tributary system, a benign state, but also a superior state. I think that is so. Yes, China, for historical reasons, was made a permanent member of the Security Council of the UN in 1945. So it has had this historical commitment to the institutions design that America has designed. It has played that game quite well generally, and has in many ways been much more respectful of those institutions than America has. But China today has found ways of infiltrating states in places like Central Asia and Africa, and bits of Asia and Latin America too, which go far beyond what America has had as its repertoire. And that has partly come because of the dislike that much of the world accumulated for the Soviet Union and for America during the Cold War. This allowed China to go in and say, we're not those guys. we are equal to you. We have experience of being colonized. We've suffered from these superpowers. We understand your traumas and your histories, and we will not treat you in those kinds of ways. We will not dictate to you how you should manage your population or what your foreign policy should be or what laws you should have on property. And we will barter with you. We will build your highways. We will give money to your police force. We'll give you equipment, training, all those kinds of things, in return for access to resources, in return for timber, in return also for immunity, because a lot of Chinese companies also don't want to be prosecuted, because a lot of them are doing very illegal things to get some of this stuff out of the ground. So a lot of these deals, they have not necessarily had the same kind of financial burdens or the same political burdens that American deals have done, and countries have leapt at them, and China therefore has got this incredible footprint. But now, and I've spent a lot of time in Africa recently, a lot of those countries are seeing the immense costs of that Chinese presence, because there are no fish in the ocean anymore, or there is no timber anymore in the forests. The farmers can't farm anymore because the land, let's say in Ghana, is so poisoned by gold mining that cocoa farming is now an impossible activity. So it's a very, very extreme presence, the Chinese presence, the one with a conception of nature, the total exploitation of nature, which has governed Chinese policy since BC, is extended to the world, and we're seeing very, very deep ecological problems as a result.
Do you think you're too harsh on China in that regard? Because, I mean, this is a really interesting conversation about, China is one of the few countries in the world which is presently seeing reforestation, not least because it's actually outsourced lots of things like, timber, expropriations from, Liberia or wherever in the continent of Africa. But there is at least, look, China is, formally speaking, on a per capita basis, a middle-income country.
Yeah.
It's extraordinarily unusual for a middle-income country to be producing something like 40% of global manufacturing output, and its CO2 emissions have peaked. Probably, it seems, right? I mean, that's an accomplishment that really is kind of at odds with this idea that it is just rapacious. Its relationship to nature is just the same as that of Britain and the United States in the last couple of centuries. I mean, you think there is a lot of continuity there. So for people who are eager to kind of amplify China's claims to climate leadership, what do you say to that?
Well, I think that I feel that people are too harsh on China in lots of ways, or rather they imagine a kind of malign China, which I don't think fits the reality. For instance, I don't think China, this is a very American idea, for instance, I don't think China is set on a World War III confrontation with the United States. It doesn't fit Chinese history. I find China to be rational and largely, let's call it, peace-loving in this respect. I think its idea of how Chinese power is accumulated is not the sort of military showdown of 1940s that America has so much in its history. And I think that the achievement or the economic achievement is without a doubt almost unparalleled in global history. I've done interviews about this book with Chinese students dispatched by newspapers and magazines in China who are now studying at Oxford or Cambridge, and their parents were factory workers. And the incredible benefits of this system they are to some extent the kind of promises of communism in the 1920s, that we will have factory worker intellectuals, that everybody will. It is extraordinary, but no, I'm not sanguine about Chinese credentials as a green power. You said that they're just as bad as Britain or America. I think they're much worse. Yes, China is got an idea of its continental landmass, which is increasingly green. It is seeking to do things in China that will protect the land and its population for decades or centuries to come. but I think it's exporting a level of kind of, precisely because it's so productive and so efficient. Its demands in terms of raw materials are just astronomical, and a lot of those demands are outsourced to very informal players who have no particular kind of scrutiny, it's legal scrutiny with regard to their labor practices and their environmental practices. Those could be Chinese players or local players, who have often got close links to corrupt brokers in the political system or the top of the economic system in those countries, and it's playing havoc. I think it's, as I say, I think American corporations actually faced legal limits on what they could do because they were in a formal context. A lot of what's informally happening across the world today is, when you see it, and I've seen it recently in places like Ghana, is quite terrifying.
We spoke to Oliver Bullough recently, who's done this new book on global money laundering, and he talks about I don't know if you've been to Vancouver recently, British Columbia. The drug problem there is crazy.
It has been for a while. Yeah.
And, he talks about how actually this is kind of connected to, yes, of course, British Columbia has a nice climate, so people with addiction issues from the rest of Canada go there. But he said a big part of it was that you had Chinese nationals wanting to go to Vancouver and gamble. They couldn't take more than a certain amount of money outside of mainland China. They needed to access hard currency there. Right. So you had this extraordinary trade of narcotics, consumer durables, and money moving between China, Europe, and North America, and Latin America as well.
How interesting.
He explained it really well. And I think that the scale at which China operates is just so hard, certainly as a Brit, it's so hard for us to comprehend. Yeah. And again, it's not to say that, China is uniquely involved in criminal activity or whatever. It's doing many quote unquote good things, not least providing, cheap EVs to the world. We're not doing that. Yeah. But I think the scale of it's really hard to understand. You've got a great quote here. There's that other number, isn't there, that over 3 years, China used more concrete than the United States did over the whole of the 20th century. This is another one. China in 2024 produced nearly 60 million tons of pork, up from 700,000 tons in 1949. So, the best part of 100-fold increase, 85-fold increase in pork, similar quantity of farmed fish. The planet simply cannot deal with this. That's a topic for another conversation. I suppose I'll end with the question of what next. The book is titled After Nations. We've just been talking about nations and about nation states. What comes after the state, the nation state, and what comes after liberalism? Because you write, liberalism has no means of recovering its former prestige. So in terms of the intellectual justifications and in terms of the actual reality of the nation state, how do you expect the next couple of decades to unfold? And in terms of big picture, what kind of direction should we be looking at in terms of not a catharsis, but what comes next?
So I think the processes we're seeing unfolding today, if unchecked, lead in a couple of directions I think we can confidently talk about. One is that leading states are not going anywhere. So yes, my book is called After Nations, but it should not imply that I think that they're all about to evaporate. They are as I said earlier, they are the political apparatus of the capitalist system. While there is a capitalist system, there will be states to administer corporations and laws and labor forces and contracts and all that. So nation states for the majority are still going to be around. I think that there might be some poor states which are not around in any particularly formal kind of way. Their borders might still exist on maps, but they will be either fought over by factions or controlled from outside completely by imperial powers, because they simply won't have the means to sustain their populations in a political community. I think we can already see some states that exist really only in an academic kind of fashion. I think one of the other things we can say is that we are likely to have at the top of the power system, we are likely to have competitions between a few leading, let's call them imperial states. China, Russia, and the United States will be some of those, but we can also count smaller players like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even Turkey, that have found extremely successful ways of sustaining themselves through transnational presences. And that in that sense, we are entering into a phase of history that's much more normal than the phase that we've been into until quite recently. The phase that we've been in quite recently, where we exist in an identifiable system that is represented by one superpower that has an ideology and a set of values that it attaches to that system, and says that this nation or this nation is counter to those values, and we should blacklist them and disapprove of them and not trade with them. I don't know in the time span you're talking about if we will feel we're part of a system in that way. I think we might feel we're part of a competition of different powers that have extremely different values, and none of them really represents the system in any unique way. And so, what our values are as a species, I don't know if we could say that anymore. That the system it's tending towards democracy or tending towards something like that. I think we might lose that sense. Liberalism, this is, I think, a critical question, and it's a big question in the book. What happens to liberalism? Because liberalism arose with the nation state. It arose with states like America and France, and in many ways has provided the infrastructure that limits the state's aggression against its own citizens and against foreign states. I think nearly all the moral prestige of the nation state comes from liberalism and the fact that it has provided the kind of ideological reason for or rationale for states to give away rights and the form in which those rights will be given away. As a footnote, because we talked about the Soviet Union earlier, the capitalist world was much better at all this when there was a Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was almost a sort of blackmail that forced capitalist states to be much more authentic in their sort of liberalism than they've been since. And I think that for me, because I call at the end of the book for something, an intellectual renaissance, maybe on the scale of the Enlightenment, where we rethink a lot of how we can perpetuate liberal values into a world that no longer has the sort of institutions to support it. I think what we do with liberalism and how we separate it from its history and give it a new future, I think that is the key intellectual question of our time. What do we think today about democracy, equality, human rights, and where will these things be institutionalized? And I think that when we talk about democracy, for me, increasingly, as I've traveled in the last year or two in places like Latin America and Africa, I think democracy means also economic democracy. I think control over the resources that surround you and your control over currencies and economic systems is as much a part of democracy as your ability to appoint or remove a leader. And I think that increasingly we've all got locked into a situation where we can remove our leaders at the ballot box, but it doesn't change our fundamentally economic situation, because currencies, central banks, corporate law, all these things are already sewn up. So I think that a lot of the new questions that have been put on the table by movements such as the crypto movement, or all these systems that have been invented in recent years that actually have drawn none of their power from nation states, are very, very interesting experiments in how we might start to think about liberalism anew.
You have a line about liberalism, which is a real cracker: a cult combining private feeling and progress.
Right.
And that on the one hand has never been more, all-encompassing. Private feeling. I mean, that's just the world now, isn't it? Too much so, I would say. and the sense of progress is obviously in decline, certainly in the West. You also say, to go back to the sort of early parts of the book, that we misunderstand the Enlightenment, because you said there we need a political project on a par with the Enlightenment to kind of come out of this impasse. Most people, again, watching or listening to this, who view themselves as liberals, view the liberal tradition, the Enlightenment tradition, as necessarily bound up with secularism, and a move away from God and theology. And what you say in the book, and also what you conclude with, is kind of that's not been the case historically, and going forward it probably won't be the case either. And I like the move you do at the end about, and I have to say, I think the analysis is much better than the conclusions and the sort of blueprint, because you don't offer a blueprint. You do the whole Marx thing of not, writing recipes for the cookshops of the future. Quite right too. But one thing you do say, which stands out to me, is this idea that we need to couch sort of theological commitments alongside commitments to nature and the oneness of the planet and planetary systems.
Right.
And I find that a really interesting move. Certainly for me politically, I mean, I view myself as an eco-socialist, as a green, but intuitively that feels very right to me. The oneness of planetary systems, even if you believe in democratic self-government of this or that place, this or that people, that's not something we can afford to ignore. It is an objective reality. So where do liberals start with this then? Does there need to be a project by liberals, for liberals, of liberals, to sort of reassess their intellectual tradition? Is that kind of a necessary precursor to do some of the stuff you're talking about? Because you meet a liberal, Rana, 9 times out of 10, they're the Richard Dawkins, you're so stupid you believe in God, etc.
Right. Well, I mean, I was brought up very much in a liberal tradition. I had very much a liberal education. A lot of the instinctive, unexamined beliefs of liberals were mine, and a lot of this book is a sort of self-examination in that respect, because I think, yes, the instinctive superiority with which liberals have looked at everybody else in the world since the 19th century, because I mean we look at a lot of that contact in places like Egypt, it needs to be examined. And I'm not sympathetic to Saturday Night Live sketches where once again we show how stupid Trump voters are. I mean, when are we going to get over this idea? I mean, when liberalism is so attacked and so hated and so maligned, and where people are developing so many things to throw at liberals, the fact that they're still sitting around saying everybody else is stupid, the only people who have any sort of real claim on the political system are us. I think it's really a combination of tragic and comic that liberalism is. But I think this is the point, that for many people it is a set of religious commitments. If you were to by religious mean cosmological, this is where the state sits, this is where God sits, this is where the people sit, and also this is kind of where intellectuals sit, or the educated classes sit, and they're the people who kind of are qualified to tell everybody else how it works. It is a cosmological diagram, and therefore lots of other people are coming up with alternative cosmological diagrams, including extremely religious diagrams. And I think at this point in time, liberals need to sort of sit back and examine a lot of the assumptions in their system that don't work for many of their compatriots and have never worked for many other people in the world. The fact that liberalism has depended, for instance, on the West being much, much richer than the rest of the world, that it seemed to function very well when the West was much, much richer than the rest of the world, when the West was growing at 3% or 5%, and that you could continue delivering all kinds of economic and political satisfactions to your populations, but it starts breaking down when those conditions disappear. Well, you should have some questions then about whether it really is a universal and eternal system, or whether it's just wedded to a particular kind of economic system or moment. The fact that lots of people in the world would rather die than submit to the secular liberal values that are presented as the sort of global orthodoxy. The fact that so many people have no problem disobeying international law in terms of illegal migration and things like that, because the legitimacy of this system has collapsed in their eyes. Clearly, there are problems with this whole model, and we need to look much more deeply about the relationships between inequality and liberalism, the relationship between religion, because a lot of the world is religious, and this system, etc. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to do in this book, is to lay the foundations for an examination that could allow us to, in some ways, realize the promise that liberalism made in the beginning. So what would a universal thought look like? What would equality look like in a much more radical sense? Equality wedded to the class system, the very steep class hierarchy of nation states, is not true equality. And at some point, the fact that all of your notion of equality is internal to a few people born in a rich country, and is wedded very much to their ability to export war, export poverty, export ecological degradation from outside their borders. This is going to cause a kind of set of residual problems that are going to come back to haunt you at some point. It's not a stable situation. So we have to think about those things anew. And yes, ecology is very much at the heart of it.
Rana, we'll leave it there. Like I say, my prediction, you heard it here first, folks. 2026, I think it'll be on the FT shortlist for Book of the Year. I could be wrong. I've been wrong about many things.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you.
But it's a fabulous book, and thank you for joining us.
This was great fun. Thanks a lot.